The winter of 1945 was unforgiving in Manchuria. Snow fell in thick, suffocating blankets across the plains of northeastern China, covering everything in white silence. But beneath that pristine surface, something darker than winter itself had taken root. Dr. Nakamura Kenji stood at the window of his quarters in Pingfang, watching the smoke rise from the crematorium chimneys. He had watched that smoke for 3 years now, and each plume carried with it the weight of decisions he could never unmake. His reflection in the glass was that of a stranger, a thin, haunted man with hollow eyes that had seen too much. Outside, the sprawling complex of Unit 731 stretched across 6 square kilometers, a city of death disguised as a water purification plant. The irony wasn't lost on him. They were purifying nothing. They were contaminating everything. Science, medicine, humanity itself. Chapter 1. The Genesis of Horror. To understand Unit 731, one must first understand the man who created it. Surgeon General Shiro Ishii, a brilliant microbiologist from the Imperial Japanese Army Medical Corps. In the early 1930s, Ishii had become obsessed with biological warfare after studying the potential of infectious diseases as weapons. He was charismatic, ambitious, and utterly devoid of moral constraints. Ishii convinced the Japanese military leadership that biological weapons could give Japan a decisive advantage in its imperial expansion across Asia. The Geneva Protocol of 1925 had banned the use of chemical and biological weapons, but Ishii saw this as proof of their effectiveness. Why would nations ban something unless it was terrifyingly powerful? He argued. In 1932, Ishii established the precursor to Unit 731 in the puppet state of Manchukuo, which Japan controlled after invading northeastern China. The location was strategic, far from prying eyes, with an endless supply of test subjects from the local Chinese population, captured resistance fighters, and prisoners labeled as threats to national security. By 1936, the facility at Pingfang was complete. It was massive, employing over 3,000 people at its peak, with dozens of buildings, including laboratories, barracks, a prison, crematoriums, and even its own airport and railway station. To the outside world, it was known as the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department. To those inside, it had another name: Zhangma Prison Camp, or simply the facility. Dr. Nakamura remembered the first time he heard the word Maruta. It meant logs in Japanese. That's what they called the prisoners, logs, as if they were nothing more than timber to be processed, measured, and discarded. Don't think of them as human, his superior had told him on his first day. They're spies, traitors, bandits. They forfeited their humanity through their crimes against the Japanese Empire. But Nakamura had seen their faces: Chinese farmers and merchants, Russian soldier, Korean independence fighters, and even some Japanese citizens accused of sedition. Men, women, and children, all reduced to experimental materials. He estimated that over the years, at least 3,000 people had been labeled as Maruta, though some historians would later suggest the number was much higher. The prisoners were kept in cells, so small they could barely move. They were fed adequately. The experiments required living subjects in various states of health, but they lived in constant terror of when they would be taken to the laboratories. One prisoner, a young Chinese woman named Li Wei, haunted Nakamura's dreams. She had been arrested for allegedly helping resistance fighters. She was 23 years old, pregnant, and terrified. He had watched as she was led to the frostbite experiments. The experiments conducted at Unit 731 represented a systematic exploration of human suffering, disguised as scientific inquiry. Each test was meticulously documented, photographed, and filed away in reports that would later be bargained for immunity. Frostbite experiments. In the bitter Manchurian winter, researchers would take prisoners outside and expose their limbs to freezing temperatures. Some had their arms or legs immersed in water that was deliberately frozen around them. Others were simply left in the cold, with wet limbs exposed to wind. The researchers would then test various methods of treatment, often thawing the frozen limbs with water of different temperatures. They discovered through countless agonizing deaths that rapid rewarming caused the most tissue damage, while gradual warming preserved more tissue but caused excruciating pain as nerves regenerated. Dr. Yoshimura Hisato, a physiologist in the unit, became the expert on frostbite. He forced prisoners to endure repeated freeze-thaw cycles, sometimes freezing and thawing the same limb multiple times until gangrene set in, and the limb had to be amputated without anesthesia. The screams, Nakamura remembered, seemed to echo in the walls long after the patients had died or lost consciousness. Vivisection studies, perhaps the most horrifying experiments, were the vivisections, surgical procedures performed on living, conscious subjects without anesthesia. The rationale was clinical. Anesthesia would alter physiological responses and contaminate the data. Prisoners were infected with diseases like plague, cholera, typhoid, and syphilis, then dissected while still alive to observe the progression of infection in real time. Surgeons would remove organs one by one, keeping the subject alive as long as possible to observe the effects. They conducted battlefield surgery practice on living prisoners, teaching new army doctors how to perform amputations and other emergency procedures. Nakamura had witnessed a vivisection only once. He had been required to attend as part of his training. A middle-aged Chinese man, infected with bubonic plague 3 days prior, was strapped to a table. No anesthesia. The head surgeon made the first incision, and the man's screams were so intense that Nakamura vomited in the corner. The surgeon barely glanced at him. "If you can't stomach this, you're in the wrong profession," the surgeon had said coldly, continuing his work as the prisoner's abdomen was opened to examine his lymph nodes and internal organs. Biological warfare development. The core mission of Unit 731 was to develop biological weapons, and to this end, prisoners were infected with a variety of pathogens. Plague-infested fleas were developed as a delivery system. Researchers would breed fleas on rats, infect them with Yersinia pestis, the plague bacterium, and then test distribution methods. Some prisoners were placed in chambers and exposed to aerosol releases of bacteria. Others were given food or water, deliberately contaminated with pathogens. The researchers meticulously tracked infection rates, symptom progression, and time to death. But the horror didn't stop at the laboratory walls. Unit 731 conducted field tests of their biological weapons on Chinese civilians. In 1940 and 1941, Japanese planes dropped plague-infected fleas over Chinese cities, including Ningbo and Changde. The resulting plague epidemics killed thousands of civilians. In some villages, every single resident died. The unit also poisoned wells and distributed contaminated food to Chinese civilians, creating what they called test zones, where they could observe disease spread in real populations. The death toll from these field experiments may have reached into the hundreds of thousands. Pressure experiments. Researchers wanted to understand the limits of human survival under extreme pressure changes, information valuable for aviation medicine and submarine operations. Prisoners were placed in pressure chambers and subjected to rapid changes in atmospheric pressure until their eyes popped from their sockets, their organs ruptured, or they died from the bends. Some subjects were placed in vacuum chambers to simulate high-altitude conditions, dying slowly as the air was pumped out, and their bodies were subjected to the effects of extreme hypoxia and decompression. Unit 731 was not the work of a few sadistic individuals. It was a massive operation involving thousands of people, from elite scientists and doctors to administrative staff, guards, and support personnel. Many of the researchers were graduates of Japan's most prestigious universities: Tokyo Imperial University, Kyoto Imperial University. They were educated men who had taken the Hippocratic Oath. They had families, children, hobbies. On weekends, some played baseball or held tea ceremonies. They were, by all conventional measures, normal people. This was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Unit 731, the banality of its evil. These weren't monsters. They were bureaucrats with clipboards, doctors with stethoscopes, scientists with microscopes. They went to work each day, conducted experiments that would make hardened criminals weep, and then went home to have dinner with their families. Dr. Nakamura had tried to understand how this happened. How had he become complicit in atrocities? The answer, he realized, lay in a series of small compromises. First, the dehumanization. The prisoners were never called by their names, always by numbers, or as Maruda. This linguistic distancing made it easier to think of them as objects rather than people. Second, the scientific framework. Everything was documented, measured, analyzed. The experiments were conducted with clinical precision, following protocols and methodologies. This veneer of scientific objectivity masked the moral horror of what they were doing. Third, the military hierarchy. Orders came from above. Refusing to participate could be seen as insubordination, potentially resulting in one's own imprisonment or execution. The military culture of absolute obedience to superiors created a system where individual moral responsibility could be abdicated to the chain of command. Fourth, the ideology. They had been taught that the Chinese were inferior, that the prisoners were criminals who deserved punishment, that Japan's imperial mission was righteous and necessary. This racist ideology provided moral cover for the inexcusable. And finally, the gradual habituation. The first time witnessing an atrocity was traumatic. The 10th time was disturbing. The 100th time was routine. The human psyche adapted to horror through repetition and normalization. Not everyone at Unit 731 accepted the work without question, though open dissent was impossible. Nakamura discovered he wasn't alone in his doubt when he met Dr. Tanaka, an older physician who had been transferred to the unit from a field hospital. They spoke in whispers during a rare moment alone in the staff quarters. "This isn't medicine," Tanaka said, his voice barely audible. "This is torture, dressed in a lab coat." "Then why do you continue?" Nakamura asked, though he already knew the answer. "For the same reason you do: fear, and the faint hope that by being here, I might somehow reduce the suffering, even if only by a fraction." It was a hollow justification, and they both knew it. But it was the only way they could live with themselves. Some staff members tried subtle acts of sabotage. A technician might accidentally contaminate a bacterial culture, ruining weeks of work. A nurse might forget to administer a painful injection. A guard might look the other way when a prisoner tried to commit suicide, allowing them to escape further torment. These acts were drops in an ocean of cruelty, but for those who performed them, they represented a desperate attempt to maintain some thread of humanity in a place designed to destroy it. Nakamura couldn't forget Li Wei, the pregnant prisoner. He had first seen her when she arrived, shackled and silent, her eyes holding a mixture of terror and defiance. In the months that followed, he watched her pregnancy progress, even as she endured preliminary medical examinations and blood draws. One winter night, he was assigned to assist with an experiment on the effects of untreated syphilis on fetal development. Li Wei was to be infected and then monitored throughout the remainder of her pregnancy. He found himself alone with her, briefly in the examination room before the procedure. She looked at him, really looked at him, and spoke in halting Japanese. "I know you're not like them," she said. I can see it in your eyes. You still have a soul. Nakamura felt tears threatening but forced them back. I can't help you, he whispered. I'm sorry. Then remember me, she replied. When this is over, when Japan has lost this war, and you will lose it, remember that we were human. Remember that we had names, families, lives. Don't let them erase us from history. He nodded, unable to speak. My name is Li Wei, she continued. I was a teacher in Harbin. I taught children how to read. My husband's name was Zhang Ming. He was a carpenter. We were going to name our baby Zhao Ming if it was a boy, Yuhua if it was a girl. Li Wei, Nakamura repeated, committing it to memory. I will remember. She was taken away for the experiment. Nakamura never spoke to her again. She died 6 weeks later, along with her unborn child, from complications of the infection. Both were dissected immediately after death for study. By 1945, the war was clearly lost for Japan. American forces were island hopping toward the Japanese homeland. The Soviet Union was preparing to enter the war against Japan. The researchers at Unit 731 knew their time was running out. Ishii called a meeting of senior staff. The Americans are coming, he said. The Soviets are coming. We must prepare for evacuation and ensure that our work doesn't fall into enemy hands. What followed was a systematic effort to destroy evidence. Documents were burned, laboratories were dismantled, but the most damning evidence, the prisoners, still remain. The order came down in August 1945, just as the Soviet invasion of Manchuria began. Eliminate all prisoners and witnesses. Nakamura was part of the team assigned to this final, terrible task. The prisoners were told they were being transferred to a new location. Instead, over 150 prisoners were murdered in a single night. Their bodies were cremated, the ashes scattered. The buildings that couldn't be moved were destroyed with explosives. But in the chaos of evacuation, not everything was destroyed. Some documents survived, some witnesses escaped, and most importantly, the perpetrators survived, many of them carrying detailed knowledge of what they had done. When American occupation forces arrived in Japan after the surrender, they quickly learned about Unit 731. General Douglas MacArthur's headquarters received reports of biological warfare experiments, and investigators were dispatched to interview participants. What happened next would become one of the most controversial decisions in the post-war period. The United States granted immunity to Unit 731 researchers in exchange for their experimental data. The reasoning was coldly pragmatic. The Cold War with the Soviet Union was already beginning. The Americans wanted the biological warfare research data before the Soviets could get it. The experiments, however unethical, had produced information that couldn't be obtained any other way. The human cost of the research had already been paid. The practical question was who would benefit from it. Dr. Shiro Ishii and his subordinates were never prosecuted for war crimes. Instead, they were debriefed by American scientists and intelligence officers. They provided detailed reports on their experiments, which were classified as top secret and used to inform American biological warfare programs. The deal was simple: complete immunity in exchange for complete disclosure, and an agreement to never share the information with any other nation, including the Soviet Union. Some researchers balked at this. Dr. Ryoichi Naito, one of Unit 731's lead scientists, initially refused to cooperate, believing the Americans would eventually prosecute them. But when it became clear that immunity was genuine, most researchers provided extensive testimony. The data was voluminous. Reports on pathogen cultivation, aerosol dissemination techniques, disease progression in humans, treatment protocols, and more. The American investigators concluded that the human experiments, while morally reprehensible, had produced unique medical and military intelligence. While Nazi doctors were prosecuted at Nuremberg for their human experiments, no such trial occurred for Unit 731. The Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, which prosecuted Japanese war criminals, never addressed Unit 731 in any meaningful way. Some prosecutors wanted to include Unit 731 in the trials. Evidence was mounting. Survivors were coming forward, and the scale of the atrocities was becoming clear. But American authorities quietly blocked these efforts, classifying information about Unit 731 and claiming insufficient evidence for prosecution. The Soviet Union, which had captured some Unit 731 personnel during their invasion of Manchuria, held their own trial in 1949 in Khabarovsk. Several researchers were convicted and sentenced to labor camps, but these sentences were relatively light. Most served less than 10 years. And the trial was dismissed in the West as Soviet propaganda during the height of Cold War tensions. The irony was bitter. The very American authorities who had prosecuted Nazi doctors for similar experiments were now protecting Japanese researchers from prosecution, not out of mercy, but out of self-interest. What happened to the perpetrators of Unit 731 in the decades after the war was perhaps as disturbing as the experiments themselves. Most went on to successful careers in medicine, academia, and business. Dr. Shiro Ishii, the architect of Unit 731, was never prosecuted. He opened a medical clinic in Tokyo. The company later became notorious for knowingly distributing HIV-contaminated blood products in the 1980s, causing hundreds of hemophiliacs to contract HIV, a scandal that some saw as a dark echo of the company's origins. Dr. Masashi Kitano, who had succeeded Ishii as commander of Unit 731, became director of the influential Kitano Hospital and president of the Japanese Medical Association. He was awarded the Order of the Rising Sun for his contributions to medicine. The psychological impact on the perpetrators varied. Some appeared to suffer no guilt whatsoever, viewing their work as a patriotic duty performed during wartime. Others, like Nakamura, were haunted by their actions. In the decades after the war, Nakamura tried to build a normal life. He married, had children, and worked as a general practitioner in a small town far from Tokyo. He never spoke of Unit 731 to his family, but the memories never left him. He would wake in the night, drenched in sweat, hearing the screams of prisoners. He saw Li Wei's face in the faces of pregnant patients. He flinched at the sight of medical instruments, remembering what they had been used for. In 1972, when he was 63 years old, a journalist working on a story about Unit 731 tracked him down. The journalist had interviewed former prisoners who had survived, and their testimonies were harrowing. He wanted Nakamura to confirm the accounts. Nakamura's first instinct was to refuse. The immunity deal had included provisions against public disclosure. Speaking out could bring legal consequences, not to mention social ostracism. But sitting across from this young journalist, seeing the photographs of survivors showing their scars, reading the testimonies, Nakamura felt something break inside. The wall he had built between his past and present crumbled. "It's all true," he said quietly. "Everything they've told you, and worse, much worse." Over the next several hours, he described what he had witnessed. He provided names, dates, details. He spoke of Li Wei and the thousands of others who had died in agony. He wept openly. For the first time in decades, the journalist's article was published, but received limited attention in Japan, where there was little appetite for confronting wartime atrocities. Nakamura faced criticism from some former colleagues and nationalist groups who accused him of being a traitor, but he also received letters from survivors and their families. For decades, the full story of Unit 731 remained largely hidden. In Japan, textbooks mentioned it briefly, if at all. In the United States, the documents obtained from Unit 731 remained classified. In China, the communist government used Unit 731 as propaganda, but also suppressed individual survivor stories that didn't fit the official narrative. The reasons for this suppression were complex. In Japan, there was a national desire to move past the war and focus on economic reconstruction. Acknowledging atrocities like Unit 731 threatened the national narrative of victimhood following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In the United States, the immunity deal with Unit 731 researchers was an embarrassment that contradicted American moral leadership in the post-war world. The fact that the U.S. had protected war criminals from prosecution while simultaneously prosecuting Nazi war criminals at Nuremberg was a hypocrisy that was easier to classify than explain. In China, the Cultural Revolution and other political upheavals meant that survivor testimonies were often lost or ignored. The communist government preferred to use Unit 731 as an abstract symbol of Japanese imperialism rather than to focus on individual human suffering. It wasn't until the 1980s and 1990s that serious historical investigation of Unit 731 began, driven largely by Japanese journalists and historians willing to confront their nation's past. In 1984, a Japanese reporter named Seiichi Morimura published a book titled The Devil's Glutton, Akuma no Hoshoku, which exposed Unit 731 to a wider Japanese audience. The book was controversial, but became a bestseller, prompting public discussion about Japan's wartime atrocities. In 1989, construction workers in Tokyo discovered bones and body parts buried near what had been a Unit 731 research facility. Forensic analysis showed the bones bore marks consistent with medical experimentation. This physical evidence made it harder for deniers to dismiss Unit 731 as exaggerated or fabricated. Throughout the 1990s, more survivors came forward, both prisoners who had somehow escaped and former staff members who, late in life, decided to testify. Their accounts corroborated each other and provided increasingly detailed pictures of the facility's operations. In 1997, the U.S. government declassified many of the documents it had obtained from Unit 731 researchers. These documents confirmed the scope and nature of the experiments and revealed the extent of American knowledge and complicity in covering up the crimes. Chinese historians also began systematically documenting Unit 731, establishing museums and memorial sites at the former Pingfang facility. The site had been partially preserved, and archaeological excavations revealed incinerators, dissection rooms, and other evidence of the experiments. Today, the site of Unit 731 in Harbin, China, has been converted into a museum. Walking through it is a haunting experience. Glass cases display surgical instruments, documents, photographs, and personal effects of victims. One room contains the remnants of the frostbite laboratory, with detailed, perhaps most affecting, are the photographs of victims. Grainy black and white images showing prisoners in various stages of experimentation. Their faces show pain, terror, resignation. These are the Maruta, the logs, revealed in death as the human beings they were in life. The museum estimates that at least 3,000 people died in the Pingfang facility alone, though the actual number may be much higher. When field experiments and biological warfare attacks are included, the death toll may reach into the hundreds of thousands. Visitors to the museum often report feeling physically ill. The documentary evidence is overwhelming and undeniable. This happened. Real people did these things to other real people, not in the distant past, but within living memory. The story of Unit 731 raises profound questions about justice, accountability, and historical memory. Should the United States have granted immunity To Unit 731 researchers, the pragmatic argument is that the data was valuable and would have been obtained by the Soviets otherwise. The moral argument is that no amount of scientific data justifies protecting war criminals from prosecution. Should Japan have prosecuted Unit 731 members after the American occupation ended? Japan regained sovereignty in 1952, but by then, the immunity deal was established, and the political will for prosecution was lacking. Some argue that Japan had a moral obligation to seek justice regardless of American pressure. Should survivors receive compensation? This question has been litigated in Japanese courts multiple times. In most cases, courts have ruled that wartime actions are not subject to individual compensation claims. Though Japan has made some collective reparations to China, many survivors feel this is inadequate, arguing that individual accountability and compensation are necessary for true justice. How should this history be taught? In Japan, the inclusion of Unit 731 in textbooks remains controversial, with some viewing it as necessary truth-telling and others seeing it as excessive focus on negative aspects of Japanese history. In China, Unit 731 is taught as part of Japanese wartime atrocities, though sometimes in ways that Chinese critics argue are propagandistic rather than educational. These questions have no easy answers, but asking them is essential to understanding the lasting impact of Unit 731. Not everyone who entered Unit 731 died there. Some prisoners were released when they were deemed no longer useful for experiments. Others escaped during the chaotic final days of the war. Their stories are testimonies to human resilience in the face of unimaginable suffering. One survivor, Zhou Guilian, was a child when she was captured and taken to Unit 731 with her mother. She witnessed horrific experiments and lived in constant fear of being selected herself. Her mother died in the facility, but Zhou survived and was released when she developed an infection that made her unsuitable for experimentation. After the war, Zhou spent decades trying to rebuild her life while carrying the trauma of what she had witnessed. She suffered from severe PTSD, nightmares, and survivor's guilt. It wasn't until the 1990s, when she was in her 60s, that she began speaking publicly about her experiences. For so many years, I tried to forget, she said in an interview. But you cannot forget something like that. It is burned into your soul. So I decided that if I cannot forget, I must remember with purpose. I must tell the story so that those who died are not forgotten. Another survivor, Yi Guanmei, was a teenager when she was arrested for allegedly harboring resistance fighters. She was subjected to frostbite experiments that left her with permanent damage to her hands and feet. After the war, she struggled with chronic pain and disability. They treated us like we were nothing, she recalled, like we were animals, or even less than animals. They would discuss our screams the way you might discuss an interesting sound from a machine. There was no recognition that we were feeling pain, that we were terrified, that we wanted to live. The testimonies of survivors have been crucial in documenting what happened at Unit 731, providing first-hand accounts that complement the documentary evidence and testimony of former staff members. Unit 731 has had a lasting impact on medical ethics, contributing to the development of modern ethical standards for human subjects research. The Nuremberg Code, established in 1947, following the prosecution of Nazi doctors, set forth principles including voluntary consent, freedom to withdraw from research, and the requirement that research benefits outweigh risks. While Unit 731 was not prosecuted at Nuremberg, the Nazi medical experiments that were prosecuted shared many similarities with Unit 731's work. The Declaration of Helsinki, adopted by the World Medical Association in 1964, further elaborated ethical principles for medical research involving human subjects. These principles are now foundational to medical ethics worldwide. Modern institutional review boards, IRBs, and ethics committees that oversee human subjects research exist in part because of atrocities like those committed by Unit 731 and the Nazi doctors. The question, how do we prevent this from happening again, has shaped the development of ethical oversight in medical research. Some ethicists have debated whether data obtained through unethical experiments should ever be used, even if it could save lives. The Unit 731 data poses this dilemma acutely. Some argue that using the data compounds the crime by benefiting from it. Others contend that refusing to use data that could save lives adds a second injustice to the first. Most medical ethicists today agree that such data should not be used if at all possible, but if it is used, it must be done with full acknowledgement of how it was obtained and recognition of the victims who suffered to produce it. Dr. Nakamura lived into his 80s, long enough to see Unit 731 become a subject of public discussion in Japan and internationally. He gave several interviews in his final years, always speaking frankly about what he had witnessed and his own complicity. "I was a coward," he said in his last interview, conducted when he was 86 years old and dying of cancer. "I told myself I had no choice, that I was following orders, that the prisoners were criminals who deserved their fate. These were lies I told myself to avoid facing the truth. I participated in atrocities because it was easier than refusing." He was asked if he believed in redemption, in the possibility of forgiveness for what he had done. "I do not ask for forgiveness," he replied. "What I did is unforgivable. I can only hope that by speaking the truth, I can in some small way honor the memory of those who suffered. I can ensure that Li Wei and all the others are not forgotten, that their deaths have meaning beyond the cruel purposes for which they were killed." He paused, then added, "The greatest lie we tell ourselves is that we would never do such things, that we are better than the people who commit atrocities. But I was an ordinary man. I was not a monster. That is the terrifying truth, that ordinary people, under the right circumstances, are capable of extraordinary evil. If we do not understand that about ourselves, we cannot prevent it from happening again." Nakamura died in 2003. At his request, his ashes were scattered at sea, with no marker or memorial. He wanted to be forgotten, believing he deserved no remembrance. But his testimonies remain part of the historical record, a crucial piece of evidence in documenting what happened at Unit 731. The legacy of Unit 731 extends into the present day in several ways. First, it remains a source of tension between Japan and its neighbors, particularly China and Korea. The perception that Japan has not adequately acknowledged or apologized for Unit 731 and other wartime atrocities contributes to ongoing distrust and political friction in East Asia. Second, it serves as a cautionary tale about the intersection of scientific research, military objectives, and ethical constraints. In an era of rapid advances in biotechnology and neuroscience, the memory of Unit 731 reminds us of the importance of maintaining ethical safeguards, even when military or security interests push for their relaxation. Third, it raises questions about how nations confront their own dark histories. The contrast between Germany's approach to Holocaust remembrance and Japan's more ambivalent approach to its wartime atrocities has been the subject of much scholarship and debate. Fourth, it highlights the dangers of dehumanization. The designation of prisoners as maruta, logs, was a linguistic tool of dehumanization that made it psychologically easier for researchers to commit atrocities. Similar processes of dehumanization can be seen in other historical and contemporary contexts, from slavery to genocide. Perhaps the most troubling aspect of the Unit 731 story is how little impact it has had on preventing subsequent atrocities. After World War II, human experiments and biological warfare research continued in various forms. During the Cold War, both the United States and Soviet Union conducted classified biological warfare research, some of which involved human subjects. The CIA's MK-Ultra program involved unwitting human subjects in experiments with LSD and other drugs. The Tuskegee syphilis study, which ran from 1932 to 1972, withheld treatment from African American men with syphilis to study the disease's natural progression. More recently, concerns have been raised about experiments conducted on prisoners, vulnerable populations, and subjects in developing countries who may not be able to provide truly informed consent. The Unit 731 story was supposed to be a lesson about the importance of ethical constraints. Instead, it sometimes seems to have been treated as a cautionary tale about getting caught, rather than about the fundamental immorality of such research. This is perhaps the final tragedy of Unit 731. Not just what happened there, but how little it changed about human behavior in the decades since. In Harbin, China, at the site of the former Unit 731 facility, there is a memorial wall. On it are inscribed the names of victims, not all of them, for many names were never recorded or have been lost to history, but as many as researchers have been able to identify. Among them is the name Li Wei, identified through survivor testimony and cross-referenced with arrest records from Harbin in 1943. Next to her name are the words, "Teacher, age 23, died along with her unborn child." The memorial exists because of the efforts of survivors, historians, and people like Dr. Nakamura, who, late in life, chose truth over comfortable silence. It exists because some people refused to let the Maruta remain nameless, refused to let them be reduced to logs in a historical footnote. The story of Unit 731 is not a pleasant one. It offers no redemption, no happy ending, no neat moral conclusions. It is a story of human capacity for cruelty, of how ordinary people can become complicit in extraordinary evil, of how justice can be sacrificed to expediency, and of how historical memory can be suppressed for decades. But it is also a story that must be told. It is a story of victims who refuse to be forgotten, of survivors who found the courage to testify, of journalists and historians who pursued the truth despite opposition, and of individuals like Nakamura, who, however belatedly, chose conscience over comfort. One aspect of the Unit 731 story that receives less attention is the fate of the children born to staff members at the facility. Many researchers and administrators lived at Pingfang with their families, creating a surreal juxtaposition of suburban family life and industrial-scale atrocity. These children grew up playing in the shadow of the crematorium chimneys. They attended schools on the compound. They celebrated birthdays and holidays, while prisoners died in agony just buildings away. Most had no idea what their parents were doing. They were told the facility was engaged in water purification and disease prevention research. Yamaguchi Hiroshi was 8 years old when his family left Pingfang in the chaotic evacuation of 1945. His father had been a mid-level administrator in Unit 731. For decades, Hiroshi believed his father had been engaged in legitimate medical research. It wasn't until 1995, when he was 58 years old, that Hiroshi learned the truth. He was watching a television documentary about Unit 731 and suddenly recognized the buildings, the layout of the compound, the faces of men he had known as Uncle Tanaka and Uncle Sato. He sat frozen as the documentary described vivisections, plague experiments, and mass murder. My entire childhood became recontextualized in that moment, Hiroshi later recalled. Every memory was suddenly dark. The smell I remembered from certain buildings, that was the crematoria. The trucks I saw leaving at night, those were carrying bodies. The screams I sometimes heard that my mother said were stray dogs, those were prisoners. Confronting his father was one of the hardest things Hiroshi ever did. His father was by then in his 80s, frail and retired. Hiroshi showed him articles about Unit 731 and asked directly, "Is this true? Were you part of this?" His father's face crumpled. "It was war," he said finally. "You don't understand what it was like. We were told it was necessary, that we were protecting Japan." "Were you protecting Japan when you helped kill Chinese civilians?" Hiroshi demanded. "When you murdered children?" His father had no answer. They never spoke of it again, and his father died 2 years later. Hiroshi was left to grapple with the knowledge that the man who had taught him to ride a bicycle and helped him with his homework had also been complicit in crimes against humanity. "How do you reconcile that?" he asked rhetorically. "How do you hold in your mind the image of your father reading you bedtime stories and the knowledge of what he did during the day?" I don't have an answer. I don't think there is an answer. While most Unit 731 staff remained silent for decades, a few felt compelled to speak out relatively early, despite the risks. In 1956, a former nurse named Shimizu Sakai published an anonymous account in a small journal, describing what she had witnessed at Pingfang. "So I live, and I carry that boy's face with me every day." Another early whistleblower was Yuasa Ken, a former doctor with a unit affiliated with Unit 731. In the 1990s, Yuasa began giving public talks about his experiences, describing vivisections he had performed and prisoners he had killed. "I want young people to understand that I was not a monster when I did these things," he said in one talk. "I was a patriotic young doctor who believed I was serving my country. That's what makes it so dangerous. If I could do these things, anyone could." Evil doesn't announce itself. It comes dressed in the language of duty, patriotism, and necessity. Yuasa's testimony was particularly valuable because he provided specific details about the psychological processes that enabled participation in atrocities. He described how prisoners were dehumanized through language and treatment, how the scientific framework provided moral distance, and how the military hierarchy discouraged dissent. "The first time I performed a vivisection, I vomited afterward," he recalled. "The 10th time, my hands didn't shake. The 20th time, I ate lunch immediately after. That progression terrifies me more than anything else about my experience. Not that I did evil things, but that I became accustomed to doing them." The international response to revelations about Unit 731 has been complicated by geopolitics, timing, and competing narratives about World War II. In the immediate post-war period, the story was suppressed by American authorities who had made the immunity deal. When the Soviet Union held trials in 1949, Western governments dismissed them as propaganda. The Cold War context meant that anything the Soviets said about Japanese war crimes was automatically suspect in the West. As relations between the United States and Japan strengthened during the Cold War, there was little incentive on either side to dwell on wartime atrocities. Japan was a crucial ally in containing communism in Asia. Highlighting Unit 731 would complicate that relationship and raise uncomfortable questions about American complicity. China, meanwhile, was isolated internationally for much of the post-war period. Under Mao, the communist government focused more on revolutionary politics than on documenting wartime atrocities in detail. The Cultural Revolution, in particular, disrupted historical research and survivor testimony. It wasn't until the 1980s and 1990s, as Cold War tensions eased and China opened up economically, that international attention began to focus seriously on Unit 731. Japanese journalists and historians played a crucial role in bringing the story to light, often facing opposition from nationalist groups in Japan. The United Nations and various human rights organizations have called on Japan to more fully acknowledge Unit 731 and provide compensation to victims. However, these calls have had limited practical effect. Japan has made some general apologies for wartime conduct, but has resisted specific acknowledgement of Unit 731 atrocities or individual compensation claims. The contrast with Germany is striking. Germany has extensively documented Nazi crimes, paid substantial reparations, and incorporated Holocaust education into its national curriculum. Japan's approach to its wartime history has been more ambivalent, with periodic disputes over textbook content and official visits to shrines honoring war dead, including convicted war criminals. This difference in approach has become a subject of scholarly debate. Some argue it reflects different political cultures and post-war circumstances. Others suggest it indicates a lack of genuine contrition in Japan. Still others point out that Germany's reckoning with its past took decades to develop fully, and that Japan may yet follow a similar path. One of the most ethically complex aspects of the Unit 731 legacy is the question of what to do with the scientific data obtained through the experiments. The data was extensive. Researchers at Unit 731 produced detailed reports on pathogen cultivation, disease progression in humans, frostbite treatment protocols, effects of various types of trauma, and much more. Some of this information was unique. It could not have been obtained through ethical means. The American scientists and military officials who reviewed this data after the war concluded that some of it was genuinely valuable. The frostbite research, for instance, provided insights into treatment protocols that were superior to existing knowledge. The data on plague transmission helped inform public health responses to potential biological warfare attacks. But using this data posed a moral dilemma. By using it, researchers would be benefiting from torture and murder. They would, in effect, be validating the claim that the experiments had produced useful knowledge. This could be seen as honoring the perpetrators rather than the victims. On the other hand, refusing to use data that could save lives seemed to add a second injustice to the first. If someone in the future died because doctors lacked knowledge that could have been derived from the Unit 731 data, wasn't that also a moral failing? Different ethicists have reached different conclusions. Some argue that the data should be used, but only with full disclosure of its origin and with acknowledgement of the victims. Others insist that using the data is morally impermissible, regardless of potential benefits. In practice, it's unclear how much Unit 731 data has actually been used in subsequent research. Some of it was incorporated into American biological warfare programs in the late 1940s and 1950s. Some frostbite research findings may have influenced treatment protocols, but much of the data was eventually deemed less valuable than initially thought, either because ethical research had subsequently reached similar conclusions, or because the experimental conditions were too extreme to be practically applicable. What is clear is that the immunity deal was based largely on an overestimation of the data's value. The Americans believed they were getting information that would give them a decisive advantage in biological warfare. In reality, much of what they got was less groundbreaking than advertised. The moral compromise may have been made for less benefit than imagined. Japan's relationship with its wartime history remains contentious, and Unit 731 sits at the center of debates about apology and accountability. Japan has issued various statements expressing remorse for its wartime conduct. In 1995, Prime Minister Tomichi Moriyama made a landmark statement expressing deep remorse and heartfelt apology for Japan's colonial rule and aggression. However, this statement was general and did not specifically address Unit 731. Subsequent prime ministers have made similar statements, though the sincerity of these apologies has been questioned when some of the same officials later visited the Yasukuni Shrine, which honors war dead, including convicted war criminals. In 2002, the Japanese government officially acknowledged the existence of Unit 731 for the first time in a court case brought by Chinese victims seeking compensation. The Tokyo District Court ruled that while the Unit 731 atrocities were historical facts, the plaintiffs' compensation claims were invalid due to statutes of limitations and other legal technicalities. This acknowledgement without accountability has frustrated survivors and their advocates. They admit it happened, but say they don't have to do anything about it, said one survivor's daughter. That's not an apology. That's just documentation. The Japanese government's position is that wartime compensation issues were resolved by post-war treaties, including the 1972 Joint Communique with China, in which China waived its right to war reparations. Individual compensation claims, the government argues, are legally moot. Critics counter that these treaties were between governments and should not prevent individual justice. They also point out that Unit 731 was kept secret for decades, so survivors couldn't pursue claims during windows when they might have been viable. The debate over apologies and compensation continues, with no resolution in sight. It remains a source of tension in Japan's relations with China and Korea, and a subject of domestic political dispute in Japan between those who favor more comprehensive acknowledgement of wartime atrocities and those who believe Japan has apologized enough. Dr. Nakamura, in his final interviews, often expressed despair that the lessons of Unit 731 had not been learned. He pointed to subsequent human rights abuses around the world as evidence that humanity had not fundamentally changed. We tell ourselves that the Holocaust and Unit 731 were aberrations, he said, that they represent humanity at its worst, and we've learned from them. But have we? Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia, Darfur, the genocides continue. Human experiments on vulnerable populations continue. The same rationalizations are used. Military necessity, national security, the greater good. He was particularly disturbed by revelations about unethical medical research that emerged decades after the war. The Tuskegee syphilis study, which withheld treatment from African American men to study the disease's progression, ran from 1932 to 1972, well into the era when the world supposedly knew better after Nuremberg and the establishment of modern research ethics. The difference, Nakamura observed, is one of degree, not of kind. The impulse to prioritize scientific knowledge or military advantage over human dignity, that impulse didn't die with Unit 731. It's still there, waiting for the right circumstances to express itself again. Modern bioethicists have studied Unit 731 as a case study in how ethical constraints can break down. Several factors that enabled Unit 731: dehumanization of subjects, military pressure, scientific rationalization, hierarchical obedience, continue to pose risks in various contexts today. The development of increasingly sophisticated biotechnology raises new concerns. CRISPR gene editing, synthetic biology, and neurotechnology all offer tremendous potential benefits, but also raise ethical questions about human experimentation and dual-use research that could be weaponized. Some ethicists worry that in an era of renewed great power competition, the pressures that led to Unit 731 could reassert themselves. If one nation perceives that rivals are gaining military advantage through ethically questionable research. Will it feel compelled to do the same? Will ethical constraints be relaxed in the name of national security? These are not hypothetical concerns. The debates over gain-of-function research, laboratory experiments that make pathogens more dangerous to study how they might evolve naturally, show how difficult it can be to balance scientific inquiry, public health concerns, and security considerations. The memory of Unit 731 should serve as a warning about what happens when these considerations are not properly balanced, when ethical constraints are discarded in pursuit of military or scientific goals. But will that warning be heeded? For those who chose to speak out about Unit 731, there were often significant personal costs. Shimizu Sake, the former nurse who published an early account, faced ostracism from her community and former colleagues. She received threatening letters and had difficulty finding employment. She died in relative poverty in 1982, her courage in speaking out unrecognized by mainstream Japanese society. Nakamura lost friends and faced criticism when he began testifying about his experiences. Some former colleagues accused him of betraying their trust. Nationalist groups branded him a traitor. He received death threats. But perhaps the deepest cost was psychological. By breaking his silence, Nakamura had to fully confront what he had done and witnessed. The mental compartmentalization that had allowed him to function for decades crumbled. He suffered from severe depression in his final years, requiring medication and therapy. "Sometimes I wish I had stayed silent," he admitted in one dark moment. "Not because I regret telling the truth, but because telling the truth means I can no longer hide from it. Even in my own mind, before, I could tell myself I was a good person who had done bad things under duress. Now I know that distinction is meaningless. I did what I did, and no amount of justification changes that." Yet he also found meaning in testimony. He received letters from survivors and their families expressing gratitude. He was invited to speak at schools and universities. He contributed to historical documentation that ensured the victims of Unit 731 would not be. "If my suffering at the end of my life can help prevent even one future atrocity," he said, "then it has value. That's the only redemption available to me. Not absolution for my sins, but the possibility that my testimony might make a difference." Other whistleblowers expressed similar sentiments. Yuasa Ken, despite facing criticism and social isolation, continued giving talks about his experiences well into his 80s. He saw it as a moral obligation. "I owe the truth to those who died," he said. "I owe it to future generations who must learn from our mistakes. And I owe it to my younger self, the idealistic medical student who took the Hippocratic Oath and believed he would help people. I betrayed that young man's ideals. The least I can do now is ensure his story serves as a warning. The documentary evidence of Unit 731's activities is extensive but incomplete. Much was destroyed in the final days of the war, and some remains classified in various archives around the world. In the 1990s and 2000s, as documents were declassified and archives opened, researchers gained access to materials that confirmed and expanded understanding of Unit 731's operations. The U.S. National Archives released interrogation reports of Unit 731 personnel, correspondence about the immunity deal, and analyses of the experimental data. These documents reveal the extent of American knowledge about Unit 731 and the decision-making process behind the immunity deal. Russian archives contain materials from the 1949 Khabarovsk trial, including testimony from Unit 731 members captured by Soviet forces. These testimonies provided detailed accounts of specific experiments and organizational structure. Chinese archives held arrest records, survivor testimonies, and post-war investigations of the Pingfong site. Archaeological work at the site has uncovered physical evidence including building remnants, medical instruments, and human remains. Japanese archives have been more limited, as many wartime documents were destroyed, and successive governments have been reluctant to fully open records. However, some materials have become available through legal challenges and changing political climates. One particularly significant document that surfaced in the 1980s was a partial personnel roster for Unit 731, listing names and roles of staff members. This allowed researchers to track what became of various individuals after the war, revealing the pattern of successful post-war careers for many perpetrators. Another important discovery was a cache of photographs taken by Unit 731 staff showing facilities, equipment, and in some cases, prisoners and experiments. These images provide visual confirmation of testimonial and documentary evidence. Perhaps most valuable have been the personal diaries and letters of Unit 731 staff members that have occasionally surfaced. These provide insights into the psychological state and moral reasoning of perpetrators, showing how ordinary people rationalized participation in atrocities. Unit 731 was not unique in the history of World War II or in the broader history of human experimentation. Understanding it requires placing it in a global context of wartime atrocities and medical research ethics. The Nazi medical experiments conducted in concentration camps bear obvious similarities to Unit 731. Both involve deliberate infliction of suffering on prisoners for purported scientific purposes. Both resulted in thousands of deaths. Both were conducted by trained medical professionals who had taken oaths to heal. However, there were also differences. The Nazi experiments were conducted on various groups deemed undesirable by Nazi ideology: Jews, Roma, disabled people, political prisoners. Unit 731 primarily targeted Chinese, Korean, and Russian subjects, driven by Japanese imperialism and racial ideology. The Nazi experiments were prosecuted at Nuremberg. Unit 731's were not. Beyond World War II, human experimentation has a long and troubling history. The Tuskegee syphilis study in the United States, the forced sterilization programs in many countries, radiation experiments during the Cold War, and various pharmaceutical trials conducted on vulnerable populations in developing countries all demonstrate that the ethical violations of Unit 731 were not isolated to one time or place. What distinguishes Unit 731 is perhaps its scale, its systematic nature, and the complete absence of even pretense of obtaining consent or providing benefit to subjects. It was industrial-scale torture, dressed in the language of science, conducted with bureaucratic efficiency and detailed documentation. How societies remember or forget atrocities like Unit 731 reveals much about their values and their willingness to confront difficult truths. In Japan, the memory of Unit 731 remains contested. Some Japanese citizens, particularly younger generations educated about wartime atrocities, view it as a shameful part of national history that must be acknowledged. Others, influenced by nationalist narratives, minimize or deny the scope of the atrocities. Still others simply prefer not to think about it, focusing instead on Japan's post-war transformation into a peaceful, prosperous democracy. This ambivalence is reflected in public monuments and education. Unlike Germany, where Holocaust memorials are prominent and education is mandatory, Japan has no equivalent national memorial for victims of wartime atrocities. The museum at the Pingfang site is in China, not Japan. Japanese textbooks' treatment of Unit 731 varies widely, with some providing substantial coverage and others mentioning it only briefly or not at all. In China, Unit 731 is taught as an example of Japanese wartime brutality, often within a broader narrative of Chinese victimization and resistance during what China calls the War of Resistance against Japanese aggression. The museum in Harbin receives thousands of visitors annually, many of them Chinese students on educational tours. However, Chinese remembrance of Unit 731 is complicated by its own political context. The communist government has sometimes used memories of Japanese atrocities to stoke nationalism or distract from domestic issues. Individual survivor stories are sometimes subordinated to official narratives that emphasize collective national suffering rather than individual human tragedy. In the West, Unit 731 remains relatively unknown compared to the Holocaust. This is partly due to timing. The Holocaust was documented and prosecuted immediately after the war, while Unit 731 was covered up for decades. It's also partly due to geography and cultural distance. For Western audiences, European atrocities feel closer and more relevant than those in Asia. But this Western unfamiliarity with Unit 731 also reflects broader patterns of how atrocities are remembered. The Holocaust has become a universal symbol of human evil, taught in schools around the world and referenced in countless contexts. Other atrocities, no matter how horrific, struggle to achieve similar recognition. This matters because memory shapes behavior. If Unit 731 remains a footnote rather than a central part of historical consciousness, its lessons will not be learned. Future perpetrators will not be deterred by its example. Future victims will not be protected by societies that have forgotten what humans are capable of doing to other humans. Unit 731 raises profound philosophical questions about human nature, morality, and the relationship between science and ethics. One of the most disturbing aspects of Unit 731 is that its perpetrators were not, by conventional measures, monsters. They were educated professionals from good families who enjoyed art, literature, and music. They loved their children. They celebrated holidays. They were, in short, normal people. This normality forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature. If ordinary people can commit extraordinary evil under certain circumstances, then the capacity for atrocity lies not in some exceptional moral deficiency, but in ordinary human psychology. Psychologist Stanley Milgram's famous obedience experiments in the 1960s, where subjects administer what they believed were dangerous electric shocks to others when ordered to do so by authority figures, suggested that most people will obey authority even when doing so violates their moral principles. Milgram's work was directly inspired by questions about how ordinary Germans participated in the Holocaust, but it applies equally to Unit 731. The circumstances that enable atrocities are frighteningly ordinary. Dehumanizing language, hierarchical authority structures, gradual habituation to violence, ideological justification, social pressure, and the diffusion of responsibility across many individuals so that no single person feels fully accountable. Unit 731 also raises questions about the relationship between scientific thinking and moral thinking. Science operates on principles of objectivity, measurement, and hypothesis testing. Moral thinking requires empathy, the recognition of others' humanity, and respect for inherent dignity. What happens when scientific methodology is applied to moral subjects? Can one scientifically study human suffering while remaining morally engaged with that suffering? The researchers at Unit 731 claim to be conducting legitimate scientific research. They followed experimental protocols, recorded data, and analyzed results. In form, their work resembled normal science. But the foundation of their work, the treatment of human beings as experimental materials without consent, made it morally bankrupt, regardless of its scientific trappings. This raises a crucial question. Is knowledge obtained through immoral means truly knowledge? Or is it tainted by its origin in such a way that it should not be considered legitimate scientific knowledge at all? Different philosophers answer this differently. Some argue that facts are facts, regardless of how they were obtained. Others insist that the process of knowledge production is inseparable from the ethical status of that knowledge. The children and grandchildren of Unit 731 survivors carry their own burden of memory. They inherited stories of trauma, saw its effects in their parents' nightmares and silences, and grappled with the question of how to honor their ancestors' suffering without being defined by it. Chen Xiaomei, whose grandmother survived Unit 731 after being subjected to pressure experiments, grew up hearing fragments of her grandmother's story. She never told me everything, Chen recalled, but I knew enough to understand that something terrible had happened to her. She had chronic pain from her injuries, and she would sometimes wake up screaming from nightmares. When Chen was a teenager, her grandmother finally told her the full story. It was traumatic for both of them, the grandmother reliving her experiences, the granddaughter learning the details of what her ancestor had endured. I felt anger, of course, Chen said. Anger at the people who did this, at the Japanese government for not providing adequate compensation, at the world for forgetting. But I also felt a sense of responsibility. My grandmother's story, and the stories of thousands like her, cannot be lost. If we forget, if we stop telling these stories, then they died for nothing. Chen became an activist, working with survivor organizations to document testimonies and advocate for recognition and compensation. She travels to Japan to meet with Japanese students and activists who are working to educate their own society about Unit 731. Some of the Japanese students cry when they hear my grandmother's story, she said. They had no idea this happened. Their education didn't cover it, or covered it only superficially. They feel betrayed by their own educational system, which kept this from them, and I feel for them. Because they're burdened with a past they didn't create, but must now reckon with, the second and third generations face a delicate balance. They must remember without becoming consumed by bitterness. They must seek justice without letting trauma define their entire existence. They must honor their ancestors while building their own lives and futures. Some find this balance easier than others. Some children of survivors became activists or historians, dedicating their lives to documenting and commemorating what happened. Others chose to focus on building successful careers and families, carrying the memory privately rather than publicly. Neither choice is wrong. Both are ways of honoring the past while living in the present. If the survivor's descendants carry the burden of victimization, the perpetrator's descendants carry the burden of guilt and shame, or the denial of it. Some descendants of Unit 731 staff have acknowledged their ancestors' roles and expressed remorse. They have participated in documentaries, contributed to historical research, and supported efforts at reconciliation. Others have denied or minimized their ancestors' involvement. They argue that their fathers or grandfathers were just following orders, that they didn't know the full extent of what was happening, or that wartime conditions made moral judgments impossible. Some have sued journalists and filmmakers who named their ancestors as Unit 731 participants, claiming defamation. The psychological burden of being descended from perpetrators of atrocities is complex. Children love their parents. That's natural and usually healthy. But what happens when you discover that your beloved parent or grandparent participated in horrific crimes? How do you reconcile the person you knew, who read you stories, taught you to swim, celebrated your achievements, with the person who committed or enabled atrocities. Some descendants experience what psychologists call transgenerational trauma, the transmission of psychological suffering across generations. Even when the crimes were committed by previous generations, descendants can experience guilt, shame, and identity confusion. Takahashi Masao, whose grandfather was a researcher at Unit 731, described his experience. "When I learned what my grandfather had done, I felt physically sick. I couldn't eat for days. I looked at photos of him, holding me as a baby, and felt contaminated. How could these hands that held me gently have dissected living prisoners?" Takahashi went through years of therapy to process these feelings. He eventually came to a position of acknowledging his grandfather's crimes while not accepting personal guilt for them. "I am not responsible for what he did," Takahashi said, "but I am responsible for how I respond to that knowledge. I can work for truth and reconciliation, even if I can never undo what was done." Some descendants of perpetrators have become advocates for remembrance and education about Unit 731. They argue that they have a particular responsibility coming from families of perpetrators to ensure that such atrocities are never repeated. Conclusion: the weight of history. Dr. Nakamura died on a gray morning in November 2003 with his daughter at his bedside. His last words were reportedly, "Remember Li Wei." His daughter, who had only learned of her father's past in his final years, carried out his final wish. She donated his testimonies and documents to a historical archive. She supported efforts to document Unit 731's history. She made sure that Li Wei's name and the names of other victims were not forgotten. The story of Unit 731 is not a comfortable story. It offers no easy moral lessons, no redemption arc, no happy end. It is a story of human capacity for cruelty, of how ordinary people can become monsters under certain circumstances, of how justice can be thwarted by political expediency, and of how historical memory is contested terrain. But it is also a story that must be told, precisely because it is uncomfortable. The victims deserve to be remembered. The perpetrator's crimes deserve to be documented. The lessons about dehumanization, about the dangers of prioritizing military or scientific goals over ethics, about the importance of individual moral responsibility, even within hierarchical systems, must be learned and relearned by each generation. In Harbin today, visitors to the Unit 731 Museum walk through exhibits that document the atrocities with clinical precision. They see photographs, documents, preserved buildings, artifacts. They read testimonies of survivors. They stand in the rooms where prisoners were held and tortured. Many visitors cry. Some become angry. Others are simply silent, overwhelmed by the weight of what they're learning. At the end of the tour, there is a visitor's book where people can write their thoughts. The entries are revealing. Never again. We must remember. Justice for the victims. Why did this happen? How could people do this? What can we learn from this? These questions are the right ones to ask. They have no simple answers, but asking them is essential, because the story of Unit 731 is not just about the past. It's about the present and the future. It's about understanding human nature, both its capacity for evil and its capacity for moral courage. It's about the choices we make when faced with pressure to compromise our ethics. It's about our responsibility to remember uncomfortable truths, even when forgetting would be easier. Li Wei, the young teacher who died at age 23, along with her unborn child, has been dead for 80 years, but her name is still spoken. Her story is still told. In death, she achieved what she asked of Nakamura that day in the examination room. She is remembered. And in being remembered, she and the thousands of other victims of Unit 731 serve a purpose beyond the cruel one to which they were killed. They remind us of what happens when humanity is forgotten, when ethics are abandoned, when the ends are allowed to justify any means. Their memory is a warning. It is also a responsibility. We must remember not just to honor the dead, but to protect the living and the yet unborn. We must remember, because forgetting would be not just a historical error, but a moral failure. The smoke from the Pingfang crematoriums stopped rising in 1945, but the questions raised by what happened there continue to rise, generation after generation, demanding answers that we must continually struggle to provide.